I think historians have long lamented the lack of Vietnamese perspectives and scholarship on the war. I mean, I remember that from my days in graduate school. It has changed, and Jessica's right, there's no doubt that this is kind of a boom period for scholarship that brings in Vietnamese voices, looks at Vietnamese sources, addresses Vietnamese perspectives and Vietnamese questions. This isn't brand new. I think this started earlier. We sometimes forget that the pioneering work done as early as the 1960s and certainly 1970s and 80s. But I think beginning around the end of the 90s up until today, there has been a lot more coming out, and there's more on the horizon. And this can be explained in part because of the newly available sources, which many historians are using, but also people who are going back and looking at old sources that had not been explored before, or looking at them in a different way, or applying new methodologies and interpretive frameworks to the historiography of the war. Together, I think they're providing a lot of new insights about the war, its origins and the conduct of the war, some of the consequences. I'm not sure that they're radically altering the sort of existing interpretations if we understand that the orthodox revisionist paradigm in historiography on the Vietnam War. I'm not sure that they're changing that, although that's maybe something we might want to discuss a little bit. So I will say a bit about some of the new scholarship and perhaps what it tells us about the origins of the war that is the subject of the roundtable. I might stray from that a little bit to look at some other things, but I would say in general, one of the points Jessica made is one that I would echo, which is that a lot of the new scholarship is really helping to show the complexity of the actors in the Vietnam War. If perhaps in a kind of simplistic telling of the war, you have Americans versus the enemy, the VC or Viet Cong, which I think is a view that few people would hold. Even as historians started to outline the reality of Americans and their South Vietnamese allies in some sort of conflict against the Southerners who were against the Southern government and the North Vietnamese, the new scholarship is helping to show that even within these groups there were many divisions and they were not monolithic. There were divisions between the United States and the Republic of Vietnam, divisions between the NLF and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, divisions within the North Vietnamese International Alliance with the Chinese and the Soviets. So all of these together, I think, are really helping us see how complex the relationship between the different parties was during the Vietnam War. So I want to look at a couple areas where there's, I think, where there have been important contributions in the scholarship. One is on South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and especially Ngo Dinh Diem, which Jessica talked about a little bit. Another is the non-revolutionary elements of South Vietnamese society, that is, people in South Vietnam who were neither necessarily loyal to the South Vietnamese government, nor were they part of the revolution or the NLF. And then the other side of that is revolutionaries in the South and the revolution in South Vietnam. And then finally, the leadership in North Vietnam. So I won't go into much detail, especially when I say something about Ngo Dinh Diem, because Jessica already alluded to this. A lot of the scholarship in the last maybe decade or so on South Vietnam has focused on Diem himself, or Diem and his brother and the leadership of the Republic of Vietnam. Phil Catton's work on strategic hamlets was one of the first, and I think it's a great book that explains Diem's vision for South Vietnam. Ed Miller has also done a lot of work on that, and both of them together really outline this kind of unusual sort of political, economic, religious, social philosophy that motivated Diem, this sort of doctrine of personalism. But there's a lot more than that. There's Jeff Stewart from Western Ontario has been looking at civic action. Jessica herself on the Michigan State group. You mentioned Peter Hansen on refugee resettlement. I think taken together, all of this scholarship helps us to some degree explain the rise of Diem and his grip on power. So I think we have a much better understanding of how exactly Diem came to power and how he tried to hold on to his authority. It's really helped us understand what motivates him. I mean, I think that's one of the changes in the scholarship, is that we we have some sense, even if it is unusual or peculiar, of what it was that Diem was trying to accomplish in South Vietnam, and how he really was trying to sort of reshape South Vietnamese society to conform to a certain vision. We see in the scholarship the ongoing assertions of independence from Diem. Diem sort of like separating himself from the Americans, even though he was receiving significant aid from the U.S. and in some ways his regime relied on American assistance. He was always kind of carving out some autonomy from the Americans. And then I think finally, a lot of the scholarship is showing not only what Diem was trying to accomplish, but why he failed and how he failed. And so it's perhaps important to note that this scholarship is not really an attempt to rehabilitate Diem in the sense that it's not arguing that he was a success, that his successes have somehow been ignored or overlooked. It's more sort of getting a fuller picture of how and why he failed. But I think the conclusion is the same. It still fits with the existing, the dominant interpretation that Diem himself was unable to sort of see his vision through to the end. One thing that I'm really excited about in the scholarship that's coming out, which I think will really help to fill out the picture of South Vietnam, is some work on elements in South Vietnam that were particularly based in Saigon and other urban centers that were anti-communist but were not necessarily devoted to the regime, especially under Diem. And there are a couple of dissertations that are in the works, I think are near completion. One is from Tuan Huang at Notre Dame. I think he's just wrapping it up now. And he looks at the middle class in Saigon. And he tries to answer a question that's very important, I think a lot of historians have asked, but have never really fully addressed, which is, why did this group fail to support the revolutionary movement in South Vietnam? What is it that prevented them from sort of swinging over to the side of the NLF or the social/national revolution? And among other things, he finds that they had a strong sense of anti-communism. They were increasingly individualist in their ethos. And he connects their attitudes to earlier periods in Vietnamese history, both during the first Indochina War and in the French colonial period. Another dissertation out of Berkeley from Nguyen Tran also looks at urban South Vietnam and looks at the formation of a South Vietnamese identity, in particular in opposition to the American presence. And she finds this tension between South Vietnamese who, on the one hand, were grateful for the American intervention, but on the other hand felt as if they had to sort of define themselves in opposition to American culture or American ideas or the behavior of Americans. So I think those will really help us to sort of see a side of South Vietnam that we haven't seen much of yet. Jessica mentioned the numerous works on the revolution in the South, and these have come out in the past few years, and it's really quite a remarkable collection. David Biggs's book on well, he calls it a hydraulic history of the Mekong Delta. It's very innovative. Environmental history study, but it does have relevance to the war, both the origins of the war and the failures of the Southern government. And he too finds some continuity. I mean, he says that looking at South Vietnam in the wartime period, you can't forget the elements that connect to both the colonial period and even the pre-colonial period, and also sort of continue on into the post-war period. And he helps to sort of explain some of the failures of the Diem government, in part because of their lack of knowledge of local conditions. They were based in Saigon and really didn't have a sense of how things worked in the provinces. David Elliott and David Hunt. And it occurs to me that there are lots of Davids who are doing it. So I don't know why that is, but they have these very detailed studies that look closely at the local level and look at the things that that animated the revolution, the elements that brought South Vietnamese into the revolutionary fold. But they also show some of the tensions within the NLF and some of the divide between the NLF and the DRV in the north. And so here again we see that complexity.